She stood at my gate in a silk dress and gold-rimmed glasses, speaking like she was reading a resolution into the official record. "You will sign the transfer papers next week. My son needs a recovery space." I looked at her, looked at the lake, looked back at her. No. She tilted her head like the word was in a foreign language. "You don't understand who you're talking to." "I do," I said. Then I turned toward my front door. "You're standing on my land." Marion Chadwick had no idea those 5 words would be the beginning of the end for her. I was fixing the 3rd wooden step on my dock when I heard heels on gravel. Not the sound of a neighbor passing through. These were deliberate footsteps, the kind made by someone who already believes they belong where they're going. My father built that cabin in the 1970s with his own hands. Every beam, every uneven floorboard, every window facing Cedar Lake meant something to him. He chose that lot for the morning light. When I inherited it 11 years ago, I maintained it the way he would have wanted. I replaced dock planks, repaired siding, and never once imagined I'd have to defend the place from someone trying to take it. Inside, near the front door, my father had hung a framed land survey from 1973. Yellowed at the edges, county-stamped, precisely measured. At the time, I thought it was just one of his retired engineer quirks. I didn't know it would become the most important thing in the house. Marion had brought her son Bryce with her, 30 years old and carrying the expression of a man who had never once been told to wait. He barely looked at me. He was already studying the porch, the dock, the shoreline, the tree line, like he was mentally rearranging the property. Marion started speaking without even pretending this was a conversation. She said she was presenting a community reallocation proposal under HOA guidelines. She talked about Bryce needing a recovery-oriented living environment. She used the phrase, equitable redistribution of underutilized community assets, like that meant anything in plain English. I asked her which article in the HOA documents gave her that authority. She told me the board had already reviewed the framework. I said, "Which article, Marion?" She said it wasn't productive to get into the weeds. So I went inside, brought back my deed and the official HOA governing documents I'd gotten from the county recorder's office months earlier, and laid them on the porch rail between us. I pointed to the property boundary. Then I pointed toward the tree line where that boundary ran. She never looked down. She stared past the papers at the lake, as if legal ownership was just an obstacle to her preferred view. I told her the conversation was over and went back inside. Through the side window, I watched her and Bryce return to their car. She was already on the phone before they reached the gate. I wrote down the time, 2:14 p.m. Then I started a second notebook, dedicated entirely to Marion Chadwick. The next morning, I called the surveying company I trusted from my years in construction engineering. I wanted fresh boundary verification. That night, while looking over county parcel maps, I noticed something I had somehow never checked before. A 30-foot strip of land along the northern side of the HOA office complex. Everyone assumed it belonged to the association. It didn't. The parcel was registered to Douglas Scott, my father. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I wrote down the parcel number and underlined it twice. A week later, after I had survey stakes placed along my property lines, Marion retaliated. A notice appeared under my front door before sunrise, printed on HOA letterhead. It cited Article 14B and claimed my survey markers were unauthorized construction. It ordered me to remove them within 72 hours or face daily fines. There was only one problem. Article 14B didn't exist. I checked the recorded HOA documents. I checked the amendments on file with the county. Nothing created an Article 14B. Nothing gave the HOA authority to stop a landowner from placing survey markers on their own titled property. By 11:40 that morning, I had written confirmation from the county clerk saying exactly that. So I drafted a response letter. No emotion, no speeches, just the facts. The real governing document, the clerk's written statement, and a side-by-side comparison showing the discrepancies in Marion's notice. I mailed it certified and kept the receipt. That afternoon, she called my cell. I let her get through 2 sentences before I told her all future communication had to be in writing, and I hung up. That evening, she posted in the neighborhood group about a disruptive property owner, creating hostile boundaries and undermining the community spirit. She didn't use my name, but she posted a photo of my survey stakes. Everyone knew who she meant. I screenshotted everything and said nothing. Then Eleanor Voss called. Eleanor was 71, lived near the HOA office, and looked exhausted in the particular way people do when they've been confused and intimidated for so long. They begin to doubt themselves. She slid a folder across her kitchen table and told me she thought there were others. 14 months earlier, she had signed what she believed was a consent form to plant hedges near her fence. 3 months later, she received an invoice from maintenance on land she no longer owned. Buried in the paperwork was a transfer of a 4,000-square-foot strip of her backyard into a private maintenance trust. She had signed away part of her property without knowing it. I wrote down the name of the trust, the date, the notary, everything. Then I spent 3 days pulling parcel histories for every lot in the Cedar Lake Association. There were 47 properties total. By the end of the second day, the pattern was obvious. In the previous 5 years, 11 properties had gone through so-called voluntary easement transfers, or covenant modifications. Strips of private land had quietly moved out of homeowner ownership. 7 of those transfers ended up in the hands of the same LLC, Lakeview Corridor Development Partners. Registered agent, Bryce Chadwick. That was the moment the whole thing changed. This was not a mother trying to get a lake house for her son. This was a land assembly operation disguised as HOA governance. The documents showed why my property mattered. My cabin sat on a piece of shoreline that made the geometry work. Without my parcel, they couldn't create the continuous lakefront frontage needed for a larger development permit. My cabin wasn't just desirable, it was necessary. Once I understood that, Marion's behavior made perfect sense. Then she got louder. A second neighborhood post accused me by name of harassing community leadership and intimidating neighbors. She mentioned the date and time of my visit to Eleanor, which meant somebody was reporting movements around that house or watching it. I didn't respond online. Instead, I called Dante Cruz, an investigative reporter I'd met years earlier at a zoning board dispute. "Are you interested in a story about HOA governance and real estate fraud?" I asked. He paused. "How much do you have?" "Enough to start," I said. At the same time, I hired an attorney, Patricia Osei, a specialist in community association law. She reviewed the documents and told me something important. Marion wasn't just bending rules. She was creating paper structures meant to look legitimate long enough to pressure people into compliance. Then Marion called an emergency HOA session. The agenda used legalistic wording, but the purpose was obvious. Create an official record that I was non-compliant, censure me, restrict my standing, and build leverage for later action. Patricia told me to attend, say little, and sign nothing. 14 households showed up out of 47. That was 19%. The bylaws required 30% for a binding vote. Marion never mentioned that. She called the vote anyway. 11 hands went up against me. 2 abstained. Eleanor voted no. Marion declared the measure passed and moved to adjourn. I sat there silently and wrote down every procedural irregularity. No quorum verification, ineligible households voting despite fee delinquency, failure to distribute the full membership roster, refusal to answer questions on the record. The next morning, Patricia confirmed what I already knew. The vote was invalid on multiple independent grounds. More importantly, it showed deliberate procedural manipulation. That same night, around 2:17 a.m., someone moved 4 of my survey stakes. Not removed, moved. Shifted just far enough to create confusion about the property line. Precise, careful, intentional. What they didn't know was that I had installed a motion-activated camera. I watched the footage 3 times. A figure in dark clothing using what looked like a rubber mallet. I copied the footage to secure storage, reset the stakes before sunrise using my own equipment, photographed everything, and opened a new folder in my filing cabinet. Physical interference. Then came the line she crossed that changed the tempo of everything. I came home one afternoon and found the front door unlocked. Not forced, opened. Nothing obvious was missing. The cabin had that eerie stillness of a place that has been disturbed and carefully put back together. Then I saw the shelf. The photographs had been shifted, and the cedar box was open. That box had belonged to my wife, Catherine. It held the smallest things she cared about near the end of her life: a folded letter, a pressed flower, a coin from the year we were married. Whoever had entered my house had taken those things out and arranged them on the floor in a loose semicircle beneath the shelf. Not smashed, not stolen, displayed. And on the kitchen table, held down by the salt shaker, was a single document. A property transfer agreement, typed, complete, and already signed by Marion Chadwick on the seller's line. My information fields were blank, waiting. I put every item from the cedar box back exactly where it belonged, closed the lid, straightened the frames on the shelf. Then I sat down and looked at the transfer agreement for 4 straight minutes before I picked up the phone. First call, sheriff's office. Second call, Patricia. Prepare everything, I told her. Fraud, burglary, intimidation, all of it. I want a package ready for court and for a prosecutor. Third call, Dante. I'm ready, I said. A few days later, another piece fell into place. Greg Salter, the HOA secretary, left me a voicemail asking to meet somewhere outside the neighborhood. We met at a diner 12 miles east. He slid a padded envelope across the table. Marion had pushed him out after he asked questions about a $22,000 reserve fund line item with no invoice behind it. Inside the envelope were photocopied minutes from 11 HOA meetings that were never entered into the official record. Sessions held after adjournment, sometimes with only 3 people present, where Marion and Bryce discussed specific properties, specific owners, and the order in which transfer agreements should be presented. My name appeared in meeting notes from 8 months earlier. Lake frontage high priority. Approach after Voss transfer confirmed. I had been on the list long before Marion ever walked up my gravel path. That night, Patricia reviewed the documents and said we now had enough to support criminal referrals. HOA fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to obtain property by deception, and a separate evidentiary thread tied to the unlawful entry at my cabin. She asked when I wanted to move. I told her, 1 more week. Because by then I knew exactly what I was going to do with my father's forgotten strip of land north of the HOA office. I called a fencing contractor I'd worked with for years, gave him the dimensions from my father's deed, asked what it would take to put steel panel fencing around the perimeter with a single gate. He said 5 business days for permitting, 2 for installation. I told him to start immediately. Monday morning arrived cold and still. By 6:17 a.m., the first fence post went into the ground. The permit was valid. The parcel was mine. The work was fully compliant. At 8:04, Marion's silver sedan pulled into the HOA complex. By then, a third of the fence line was already standing. 6-foot black steel set in concrete, running exactly along the boundary of the strip my father had bought decades earlier. She got out, marched toward the crew, and demanded they stop. The lead worker handed her the permit. She looked at it, looked at the fence, looked at the parcel reference showing the registered owner. The sound she made wasn't quite a word. She called the police. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived, reviewed the permit, checked the parcel records, and confirmed exactly what she did not want confirmed. The land was privately owned, the construction was lawful, and there was no basis to halt the work. Neighbors started gathering. Eleanor came. Greg came. A few other homeowners who had quietly spoken to me over the past weeks came too. Then Dante arrived with a camera operator, and finally, a representative from the district attorney's office arrived in an unmarked sedan, arranged by Patricia. At 9:45, I walked over carrying 3 manila envelopes, one for the senior deputy, one for Dante, one for the DA representative. Inside were the recertified surveys, the fraudulent amendment documentation, the invalid HOA records, the parcel transfer trail, Greg's meeting minutes, the burglary report, the pre-signed transfer agreement, the LLC filings naming Bryce, and the development fund links tying the land grab to something much bigger than one neighborhood dispute. 114 pages, tabbed, organized, irreversible. The fence mattered for one reason above all. It made reality visible. The HOA office still sat where it always had. The road hadn't moved. The parking lot hadn't moved. But now the invisible line between what everyone assumed and what the deed actually said stood there in steel and concrete for every person to see. Marion could argue with a man. She could bully a neighbor. She could manipulate a meeting. She could not argue with a recorded survey, a county permit, a lawful fence, and a prosecutor holding the file. After that, things moved quickly. Patricia filed the formal fraud complaint. The sheriff opened a criminal investigation into the break-in and intimidation. Bryce's LLC was hit with a civil investigative demand, and its accounts were frozen pending audit. The Regional Development Fund suspended disbursements. A city council member connected to the operation withdrew from re-election. 4 weeks after the fence went up, Marion Chadwick was formally charged. HOA governance fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to obtain property by deception, criminal facilitation of unlawful entry. Bryce wasn't charged immediately, but his LLC remained under investigation, and the 7 transferred parcels were referred to court for voidance proceedings. The Cedar Lake Association held a court-ordered board re-election 6 weeks later. Turnout was the highest in its history. Eleanor Voss won a seat. She called me afterward and said only one thing: "I got my backyard back." All 7 disputed transfers were eventually reversed. Dante's reporting ran as a 3-part series and spread beyond the county. Greg declined returning to HOA work, said he needed a break from governance. I didn't blame him. Late that November, I drove back to the cabin in peace for the first time since all of it had started. The fence stood exactly where it belonged. The survey stakes were untouched. The dock steps were solid underfoot. I made coffee and sat on the porch until the morning light came across the lake, the way my father always said it would. Flat, gold, unhurried. Inside, I straightened the shelf again. I aligned the photographs. I set Catherine's cedar box back in its place and left it there. The cabin was quiet the way it was meant to be quiet. Not empty, not lonely. Just still. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. No name, no explanation. Just a GPS coordinate and one sentence. They didn't work alone. The coordinates pointed to another parcel 3 miles outside Cedar Lake, on another shoreline entirely. A new survey had been filed there the previous month under a name I didn't